So this is a presentation of the aquatic plant survey and Eurasian water milfoil survey results from 2020 in Dutch Hollow Lake. This map that you're seeing right here is found on page 6 of the report. So I point this out first to make sure that those who are watching know where to find locations of named bays as they are mentioned in the presentation. So as I present results, I will be referencing where the figures and the tables can be found in the report. So as I mentioned, this is on page 6 of the report. Also, I'm going to go over the overall aquatic plant survey results first, quick, and then I will focus on Eurasian water milfoil results. So really quick first, I just want to fly through some methods. As I mentioned, there were 2 main surveys that were done. There's the aquatic plant point intercept survey and the Eurasian water milfoil bed survey. The first was focused on all aquatic plant species, and there was a grid of 436 sample points. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you see a match of Dutch Hollow Lake, and there's 436 points. Those points have latitude, longitude coordinates that are loaded into a handheld GPS, and then we navigate from point to point in the boat, and we have a 2-headed rake, and then we take rake samples at those points unless the points are too deep to sample. The second survey, the Eurasian water milfoil bed survey, really was involved us driving along the areas where milfoil was found and delineating the beds of dense milfoil. And so pictured in the bottom middle is sort of a very dense area of Eurasian water milfoil and a rake sample being taken. On the left-hand side, you see the rating of a rake fullness of 1, very few plants, a rake fullness of 2. The rake head is covered, but the tines are not, and a rake fullness of 3, the rake head is completely covered. So that's just a really quick overview of the methods because as I present the results, it'll be handy to know how we collected the information. So here is the table. This is actually a table that is just full of valuable information. In fact, I would say this table is probably valued at $16,000. And the reason why I say that is because it reflects an approximation of the investment made in Dutch Hollow data collection since 2011. So if you figure there's 8 surveys represented here, and each survey was $2,000, which I think is probably on the low end. It probably just involves mostly the field work and wouldn't really include the number crunching, the map creation, that sort of thing. That's where I get the $16,000. And so some of the surveys, I think at least one of them was funded by the DNR, but most were funded by Dutch Hollow Lake. And so I just want to put a shout out and personally thank you for the opportunity to work with your lake group since 2016. And also say well done to your group for investing in your lake. So getting back to the numbers, I have highlighted row 5 here in red. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what these numbers mean because I'm going to be referring to this type of number throughout the presentation. Row number 5 tells us the percentage of sites where plants were actually found in comparison to the sites where they could be found. So in other words, this is the number of the sites with vegetation, or row number 2, divided by the total number of sites equal to or shallower than the maximum depth of plants, row 4. We call this littoral frequency or frequency of occurrence or just frequency. And like I said, I'm going to be talking about frequency throughout the presentation, so just keep that in mind. The column on the far right represents the results from 2020. So compared to other lakes in the Driftless region, Dutch Hollow continues to have a high species richness and healthy aquatic plant community. So that's really good news. The last couple of rows are blocked off for now, but I'll come back to those when we go over milfoil results. And this table is found on page 10 of the report. This map, which is found on page 12, illustrates the littoral frequency of all the species found. So this is total rake fullness when you lump all of the species together. So in other words, this map shows where those 86% of sites where plants could be found actually were found. So it also shows the rake fullness. So the larger dark green circles is where you've got higher density aquatic plants. Medium green circles is where you've got medium rake fullness of 2, and then the light small green circles is where you have low density plant occurrence. The hollow circles kind of in the middle and towards the northeast is where plants could be found, but it was shallow enough where plants could have been found, but they were not. This next table is on page 14. This one lists all of the species found in Dutch Hollow Lake during the 2020 survey. They're listed in order of frequency from highest to lowest. So the most common species is at the top. That's forked duckweed. It's also pictured on the left-hand side there. And so if you follow the name forked duckweed over to the scientific name, over to the number of sites, 147, and then we get to littoral frequency, that's that frequency that I keep talking about. That was found at 42% of sites. The second most common, unfortunately, was Eurasian water milfoil, pictured at the left there. And Eurasian water milfoil was found at 41%. The third most common species was flat stem pondweed, pictured at the bottom left, and that was found at 33% of sites. So here is forked duckweed actually mapped out. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it was found at 42% of sites where plants could occur. Notice you never see a rake fullness of 3 for forked duckweed, although some areas were very abundant in this plant. It's just such a small plant that you're never going to see a rake fullness of 3 for it. And you can see again in the picture at the bottom left, it's just a really small free-floating plant. Here's a map of Eurasian water milfoil. I'll get into another map a little bit later, but this is just how the Eurasian water milfoil occurrence compares to the other plant species in the lake. And so here you see rake fullness ratings of 1, 2, and 3. And then here's the map of flat stem pondweed found at 33% of littoral points. And a lot of it you can see is kind of found up there in Woodland Bay. So now I'm going to just shift over to the Eurasian water milfoil results, and we're back at that $16,000 table. This time I want to point out the bottom 2 rows that I skipped over before. So the bottom, the second to bottom row lists the littoral frequency of occurrence for Eurasian water milfoil from 2011 all the way to 2020. And as I already mentioned, milfoil was at 41% in 2020, which is actually the highest littoral frequency documented since 2011. It's followed closely by 2016, where you had 39% littoral frequency. Also, for quick reference, if you look at the bottom, I've listed the whole lake herbicide treatments with the blue arrows kind of pointing to where they occurred in time compared to the surveys that were done. So the blue arrows are the whole lake herbicide treatments, and then the white arrow is from a 10-acre treatment in Woodland Bay in 2019. I will come back to the topic of herbicide treatments as we get towards the end. This map and this table found on pages 17 and 18. The map illustrates the Eurasian water milfoil frequency as already presented with the rake fullness dots of 1, 2, and 3, but it also shows us the milfoil beds. As I mentioned, I did a milfoil bed survey where we drove around the lake and mapped where the dense Eurasian water milfoil beds occurred. So the bright blue area represents beds of milfoil, as I mentioned, and those are labeled A20 through T20. So each bed has its own label, and then those labels are listed on the left in that table and gives more information like location, acres, the depth, milfoil height, milfoil density, and the average rake fullness. There were 20 beds of milfoil that were mapped, and those totaled 25 acres. That compares to, I believe, 8 beds of milfoil that were mapped in 2019. So that's a pretty big difference, 8 beds to 20 beds. But in 2019, it was 20 acres compared to, 2019, it was 20 acres. I want to make sure I said that right. Compared to in 2020, it was 25.5 acres. So it's a lot more beds, but not necessarily that much higher acreage, which I'm not downplaying the level of Eurasian water milfoil. I just want to point out that the number of beds doesn't necessarily correlate to that much higher acreage. If you look at the top right of the map, near where the clubhouse is, that pink area represents where dash occurred in 2020. And that's also where dash occurred in 2019, but it was extended a little bit to the east as well. The small yellow circles you kind of see sprinkled throughout the map are where single plants of Eurasian water milfoil were found as we conducted the survey. So these single plants are very small clumps of milfoil, and they were no more abundant than native species nearby, and therefore those milfoil were not behaving invasively yet. Their locations appear very close and clustered on the map, but that's just kind of a function of the scale of the map. In real space, they were far enough apart to not warrant mapping their locations as a solid bed of milfoil. But I wanted to note their occurrence to provide a more comprehensive picture of milfoil locations in 2020. So then lastly, you see the purple area at the top left in Woodland Bay, and that shows that 10-acre treatment that took place in 2019. This photo was taken August 11th, I believe, right after the survey was done, and it shows, it's taken from a drone and captures the canopied milfoil within and outside the swimming area, and it's circled in black. And so you see that sort of pinkish sort of look, which is very solid on the outside of the swimming area, but kind of speckled on the inside of the swimming area. That's canopied and flowering Eurasian water milfoil. Submerged aquatic plant growth is discernible, but the darker color than the canopy plant is likely milfoil, but it could be mixed with native species. So also visible in the drone photo are the 10 benthic barriers, and those are circled in red. So ultimately from this photo and comparing it to what we saw in 2019, we can see relief from milfoil was more complete in 2019 when dash was deployed for 2 weeks. In 2020, 1 week of dash work definitely provided some Eurasian water milfoil control, but it was not as complete as 2019. So here I'm going to focus on the Woodland Bay herbicide treatment, and this information is found on page 20 of the report. So the map that you see on the left here represents the pre-treatment conditions. Eurasian water milfoil was found at 18 out of 34 sample points, which is 53% of sample points. And then there's a table at the bottom there that lists out all this information. There's a big difference in 2019 where Eurasian water milfoil was present at only 1 out of 57 sample points. I ramped up the sampling effort in this area to be able to have greater sensitivity in detecting changes as we go forward. And then in 2020, milfoil was present at 19 out of 57 points. Now this is still only 33% compared to 53% in 2018 of sample points, but it is significantly higher than the milfoil right after treatment in 2019, unfortunately. There was also a small bed of Eurasian water milfoil that was mapped in Woodland Bay, which was 0.33 acres, and that's Q20 that you see there. So I mentioned that really expensive table earlier. The graphs that I'm going to be presenting right now are also extremely valuable because they sort of summarize the data collected since 2011. What I'm showing you here is the results of the chi-squared analyses for plant species in Dutch Hollow Lake from 2011 to 2020. On the y-axis, you see, or the vertical axis, you see the percent frequency So 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, those are percentages. And then on the x-axis is the year when the survey was done. The dashed vertical lines represent the years when the whole lake herbicide treatments were done. And then the solid faint blue line is the 10-acre herbicide treatment in Woodland Bay in 2019. The open circles that you see on each graph represent no statistically significant change when compared to the previous survey. Solid circles tell us there was a significant change compared to the previous survey. Some of the plant names have a black plus sign or a red minus sign. A black plus sign means there was a significant increase in 2020 compared to the first year, 2011. The red minus sign means there was a significant decrease in 2020 compared to 2011. So here, let's just go through wild celery real quick. If you look at the top left graph in 2011, it's an open circle, that's the first year. And then the next survey in 2013, another open circle. So wild celery increased in occurrence, but it was not significant. Then you go to 2015, the next survey, and that increase was considered significant from a statistical standpoint. And then as you go along the graph, none of the additional changes were significant. However, if you compare 2020 to 2011, then the increase was considered significant. So that's how you kind of digest these graphs. What I just want to point out here, the reason why it's important to look at these changes over time is because we want to track if there's any native species decline over time. And compared to 2011, there were 7 native species that had statistically significant decline in 2020 when compared to 2011. One native species saw statistically significant increase compared to 2011. And then milfoil, you see a statistically significant increase compared to 2019 and compared to the first year of 2011. So now I've kind of gone through all of the results, and what I'd like to do is digest a few more things more in greater detail before opening it up for questions. And so I'll go through these real quick. So again, I mentioned Eurasia water milfoil increased significantly from 27% in 2019 to 41% in 2020. So here's a milfoil map of 2019 compared to 2020. And you can also see the Woodland Bay herbicide treatment area. And so what this map shows us is that the areas of milfoil growth in 2019 on your left continue to be the same areas where milfoil is growing in 2020. And that's really no surprise. Those have been sort of problem areas, ongoing problem areas. But what's noteworthy is that you're continuing to see increased milfoil occurrence in Summit Bay along the eastern shore. And then also, what I was kind of surprised to see was the milfoil growing on the west bay of, on the west shore of Summit Bay. Same thing in Black Forest. As I said, I've been working on Dutch Hollow Lake since 2016, and I don't recall seeing as much milfoil as I did in Black Forest Bay this year. So those were just some things that I noticed that were that seemed to be quite different from last year. Now, this table lists the herbicide treatment history since 2011, and this is found on page 27 of the report. So on the right-hand side is the corresponding milfoil frequency measured that year. So before I get into the details of this table, I just want to mention that herbicide is the most commonly used method for milfoil control in Wisconsin as well as in Dutch Hollow Lake. In fact, one study of 23 Wisconsin lakes found the longevity of control ranging from 2 to 8 years. So essentially what I'm trying to drive home is that it's reasonable to expect at least 2 years of decent milfoil control after a whole lake treatment. So let me just point out a few herbicide treatments. So highlighted here, you see the herbicide treatment that was done on a whole lake scale in 2013. And then if you look to the right along that row, when the survey was done, there was 9% milfoil occurrence in 2013. So good control that same year of treatment. A consecutive year of treatment was done in 2014 on a whole lake scale, but unfortunately there's no data available for that year. And then, even though we're trying to kind of focus on the whole lake treatments, I've circled in blue some of the smaller treatments that have occurred. So after 2014, you've got 8 acres of herbicide treatment in 2015. Milfoil occurrence stayed low at 10% in 2015, but if we focus only on whole lake herbicide treatments, the 2014 efforts lasted for only 1 to 2 years, because by August of 2016, the milfoil was at 39%. And then that high frequency of 39% triggered much concern and ultimately the herbicide treatment in 2017. So no herbicide treatment was done then in 2018. The milfoil frequency was at 20%. And then you've got 10 acres of herbicide treatment in 2019, and that was in Woodland Bay, Milfoil Bay. And the frequency still continued to increase to 27%. There was no herbicide treatment in 2020, and now we're at 41%. And so what I'm just trying to lay out is that with the most recent round of whole lake treatment, it lasted for all of 2017. There was good control in all of 2017 and all of 2018, but by 2019, the milfoil was at levels of concern for Dutch Hollow Lake. It's my understanding it was at a level of concern for Dutch Hollow Lake residents. And so some management considerations going forward. For any future herbicide treatments, I think it's important to remember that it is reasonable to expect whole lake herbicide treatments to last longer than 2 years. If they're lasting 1 to 2 years in Dutch Hollow with additional smaller scale treatments in between, it raises some red flags, I think. And that leads me to wonder if alternative herbicides with different modes of action might be explored for future treatment. And I've listed a couple here. So 2,4-D is the traditional herbicide that's been used. But endothol, a mixture of endothol and 2,4-D have been considered in lakes that have been particularly problematic for controlling milfoil. Fluoridone's also considered. I'm not necessarily endorsing one of these approaches. I'm just throwing them out there, and I think that discussion among DNR, potentially Sauk County, myself, and possibly even the herbicide applicator is definitely needed. Also, something to consider is genetic analysis in 2021 to rule out hybrid milfoil, because hybrid milfoil tends to resist traditional 2,4-D herbicide treatment. None of the milfoil looked hybrid to me, but it doesn't necessarily have to look hybrid for it to actually be a genetic hybrid strain. Then of course there's mechanical harvest for large scale control, dash and manual removal for small scale control. And so I think that ultimately, looking at the numbers, looking at the longevity of herbicide control, consideration of additional alternative control measures would be worthwhile. And that completes my presentation.